Isadora Vance woke to the sound of bells. Not the small cracked bell outside her aunt's cold house. Not the dull morning call that usually dragged her from sleep and back into duty. These bells were deeper, grander, shaking through stone walls and golden ceilings, like the whole capital had been ordered to celebrate something. Her head ached, as though the entire kingdom had marched through it. For a moment, she kept her eyes closed, afraid to move, afraid to remember. There had been wine, too much wine. There had been music, candlelight, silk gowns, cruel laughter, and Lady Lyra Sterling's voice cutting through the royal celebration like a polished knife. There had been her aunt's shame-filled glare, nobles whispering behind jeweled fans, and Isadora standing in the middle of it all with a stained gown and a wounded pride she refused to show. Then she opened her eyes. Above her were curtains of gold. Beneath her were sheets, softer than anything she had ever touched. At the side of the bed stood palace maids with lowered heads, their hands folded as though they were waiting for a command from someone important. Isadora stared at them through the fog of her headache, certain she had not fully awakened. Then her gaze moved to the small velvet cushion beside her pillow. A crown rested on it. Not a borrowed ornament, not a festival decoration. A real crown, heavy with gold, pearls, and a power that did not belong anywhere near her. One of the maids bowed. She called Isadora Your Majesty. The words struck harder than the bells. Isadora sat up too quickly, panic rushing through her, as broken pieces of the night before returned. The great hall, the king on his throne, the court laughing at her, her own voice, bold from wine and heartbreak, asking King Alaric to marry her, as though marriage to a monarch were nothing more than a drunken joke. Everyone had laughed. Lady Lyra had smiled, as if Isadora had finally destroyed herself. Lord Gideon Thorne had looked offended. Duke Valerius Vance had watched in silence. But the king had not laughed. And now, outside the palace windows, thousands of voices were rising with the bells, shouting for the new queen. By morning, the joke had become law. By morning, Isadora Vance was no longer the ruined girl everyone mocked. She was queen. But Isadora did not yet know that her drunken words had not only placed a crown upon her head, they had placed a target upon her back. One day earlier, before the bells, before the crown, before the kingdom learned her name, Isadora Vance had been nothing more than a woman people enjoyed looking down on. She lived in the last quiet corner of a ruined noble house, where the walls still carried the memory of better days, but the rooms had grown cold from debt, grief, and disappointment. Once the Vance name had opened doors. Once carriages had stopped before their gate, and servants had polished silver beneath chandeliers. But all of that had disappeared after her parents died, leaving Isadora with nothing except an old family name, a few faded gowns, and an aunt who treated kindness as though it were a weakness. Mrs. Rosamond Vance never allowed Isadora to forget what she had lost. Every morning came with a reminder. Isadora was too poor to be respected, too outspoken to be married, too proud for her own good, and too unlucky to bring honor back to the family. Her aunt said these things with the calm cruelty of a woman who had repeated them so many times that they had begun to sound like truth. But Isadora never gave her the satisfaction of breaking. She laughed when she wanted to cry. She smiled when her heart felt bruised. She answered insults with wit, because wit was the only weapon poverty had not taken from her. And though the world called her ruined, she carried herself with the quiet stubbornness of someone who still believed she had not been made for dust. That evening, the capital glittered like a jewel. The royal palace had opened its gates for the grand celebration, and every noble family in the kingdom had arrived dressed in velvet, pearls, and ambition. Lanterns burned along the marble steps. Music floated through the open courtyards. Fountains shimmered beneath the moonlight. Everywhere people whispered of only one thing. By night's end, King Alaric Draven was expected to announce his future queen, and everyone already believed they knew her name, Lady Lyra Sterling. She moved through the palace as if the crown had already been placed upon her head. Beautiful, graceful, and dressed in silver silk, Lyra accepted every bow, every compliment, every admiring glance with the calm confidence of a woman who had never once doubted that the world belonged to her. Nobles gathered around her like moths around a flame. Some praised her beauty, others praised her bloodline. Many praised her simply because they believed she would soon be powerful enough to punish those who did not. Isadora would never have attended such a celebration by choice. Mrs. Rosamond had dragged her there, not out of affection, but because the old woman still hoped to squeeze some favor from the Vance name before it vanished completely. Isadora was dressed in a gown that had once belonged to her mother, carefully repaired at the sleeves and hem until the stitches looked almost invisible. Almost. In a room full of silk and diamonds, almost was never enough. The moment Isadora stepped into the palace, she felt the eyes. Some looked at her with pity, some with amusement, some with the eager cruelty of people who enjoyed watching someone stand where they were not wanted. Mrs. Rosamond's fingers tightened around her arm, not in comfort, but in warning. Isadora was to smile, stay quiet, and embarrass no one. But embarrassment had already found her. Near the center of the hall, Lady Lyra Sterling turned at the sound of Isadora's name. Her gaze moved slowly from Isadora's repaired gown to her worn gloves, then back to her face, with a smile so delicate it almost looked kind. Almost. The words that followed were soft enough to seem polite and sharp enough to draw blood. Lady Lyra called her a faded flower from a dead family, and the nobles nearby laughed behind their fans as though cruelty had become part of the evening's entertainment. Isadora felt the sting of it, hot and sudden. For one breath, she was a little girl again, standing in the doorway of a house after a funeral, listening to adults discuss her future, as though she were furniture no one wanted to inherit. But she swallowed the pain. She lifted her chin. She even smiled, because if they wanted tears from her, they would have to wait longer than one insult. From across the hall, Duke Valerius Vance watched in silence. He had the stillness of a man who missed nothing. Tall, composed, and dressed in dark formal attire, he stood apart from the laughing nobles with his hands behind his back and his eyes fixed on Isadora. He knew the Vance name. He knew its glory, its fall, and the scandal that had split his branch of the family from hers years before. But what interested him in that moment was not her name. It was the way she refused to bend beneath humiliation. A few steps beyond him, King Alaric Draven saw her too. He sat beneath the weight of a crown everyone envied and no one understood. Around him, nobles smiled too brightly, bowed too deeply, and spoke with voices polished by lies. Yet his attention moved past all of them and settled on the woman in the repaired gown, the one being mocked in the middle of his shining court. She had no army, no influence, no jewels worth stealing. But she had something rare. She was hurt and still standing. She was ashamed and still proud. She was surrounded by cruelty, yet she refused to become cruel herself. Isadora thought the king was only watching her shame. She did not know he was watching the only honest woman in the room. The celebration went on as though Isadora's humiliation had been nothing more than a small decoration added to the evening. Music rose again beneath the painted ceilings. Silver trays moved from hand to hand. Nobles returned to their laughter, their gossip, their careful games of power. And at the center of it all stood Lady Lyra Sterling, shining so brightly that everyone else seemed expected to dim themselves in her presence. She was treated not like a guest, but like a queen, waiting for her crown. Lords bowed over her hand. Ladies praised the perfection of her gown. Old councilmen spoke of her bloodline with the seriousness of men discussing the future of the kingdom. Every compliment placed another invisible jewel upon her head, and Lady Lyra accepted them all with a graceful smile, as if she had been born to receive admiration without surprise. Isadora stood near the edge of the hall, where the candlelight did not reach as warmly. Her repaired gown felt tighter than before. The laughter from Lady Lyra's insult still seemed to cling to her skin, though she kept her face calm. She told herself it did not matter. She had survived worse than a noblewoman's sharp tongue. She had survived grief. She had survived hunger disguised as dignity. She had survived Mrs. Rosamond Vance. But survival did not mean nothing hurt. Her aunt found her a moment later, eyes burning with embarrassment. Mrs. Rosamond's voice was low, but each word landed like a slap. Isadora had shamed the family. Isadora had drawn attention. Isadora could not even stand quietly in a palace without reminding everyone that the Vance name had fallen into disgrace. Isadora tried to answer, but her aunt's fingers closed around her arm, not tightly enough to cause pain anyone else would notice. Just enough to remind her who had control over the roof she slept under and the bread she ate. Then, as if the evening had not already taken enough from her, a young nobleman passed too close with a jeweled cup in hand. Whether by accident or cruelty, the wine spilled across the front of Isadora's gown, blooming dark red over the faded fabric. The hall went still for half a breath. Then the nobleman laughed. Others followed. Isadora looked down at the stain spreading across the only decent gown she owned, her mother's gown. The one she had spent nights repairing by candlelight, hoping no one would notice the age of the seams. Lady Lyra's voice drifted through the laughter, soft and poisonous. She said the stain suited Isadora. Ruin, after all, looked natural on some women. The laughter grew louder. Isadora smiled. It was not because anything was funny. It was because if she did not smile, something inside her might break in front of them, and she would rather swallow glass than give Lady Lyra that victory. So she laughed lightly, as if the insult had missed its mark, as if her heart had not folded inward, as if she did not suddenly wish she had never come to the palace at all. A servant appeared beside her with a cup of wine. Perhaps he pitied her. Perhaps he had simply been passing by. Isadora did not ask. She took the cup, whispered a thank you, and drank. The warmth spread quickly through her chest. For the first time that evening, the room felt less sharp. Another cup found her hand, then another. The music softened around the edges. The chandeliers blurred into stars. The cruel faces of the court became less frightening and more ridiculous. All those powdered smiles, all those stiff backs, all those people pretending they had never suffered, never lied, never begged for something they could not have. By the time the royal trumpets sounded, Isadora was no longer calm. She was wounded. She was angry. She was tired of being small in a room full of people who had mistaken wealth for worth. The music faded. Every face turned toward the throne. King Alaric Draven rose slowly, and silence fell with him. He looked every inch a monarch, tall, composed, unreadable beneath the weight of his crown. But even from where she stood, Isadora could see the shadow behind his eyes. He did not look like a man about to announce joy. He looked like a man walking toward a door someone else had locked from the outside. Near him, Lord Gideon Thorne leaned close, speaking in a voice too low for most to hear. Members of the royal council watched with hungry expectation. Lady Lyra lowered her lashes, already wearing the expression of a woman preparing to accept destiny. Everyone knew what was supposed to happen. The king was supposed to choose her. The court was supposed to cheer. Lady Lyra Sterling was supposed to become the future queen, and Isadora Vance was supposed to remain nothing. The thought rose in Isadora's wine-warmed mind with sudden, dangerous clarity. Nothing. That was what they had called her without saying it. A faded flower, a ruined girl, a stain on her family name. A woman fit only to be mocked in corners while others were raised toward crowns. King Alaric opened his mouth to speak. Before he could say a word, Isadora stepped forward. The sound that passed through the court was not quite a gasp and not quite a warning. It was the sound of hundreds of people realizing that someone who had no place in the story had suddenly walked into the center of it. Mrs. Rosamond went pale. Duke Valerius Vance turned his head sharply. Lady Lyra's perfect smile froze. Isadora moved with the unsteady grace of a woman who had drunk enough wine to forget fear, but not enough to forget pain. She crossed the polished floor, stopped before the throne, and bowed so dramatically that several nobles covered their mouths. When she lifted her head, her eyes were bright. Then she looked at the king and spoke loud enough for the entire court to hear. "Your Majesty, if marriage must be your punishment tonight, marry me. I may be poor, but I promise I will never bore you." For one stunned heartbeat, there was silence. Then the palace erupted. Laughter exploded from every side of the hall. Some nobles bent over with it. Some whispered behind their fans. Others looked at Isadora as though they had just witnessed a woman throw herself from a balcony and call it dancing. Mrs. Rosamond seemed ready to collapse from shame. Lady Lyra smiled slowly, cruelly, beautifully, like a woman watching an enemy light the match to her own destruction. Lord Gideon Thorne looked offended by the very air Isadora breathed. Even Prince Lucian, standing near the throne, laughed before he could stop himself. Isadora should have stepped back. She should have apologized. She should have remembered who she was and who he was. But the wine and the humiliation had made her reckless. And for one strange moment, the laughter did not wound her. It freed her, because now they were laughing openly. At least there was honesty in that. But then King Alaric moved. The laughter began to thin. He descended from the throne with slow, deliberate steps, his cloak trailing behind him over the marble floor. He did not look amused. He did not look angry either. That was worse. His face was calm in a way that made every noble straighten. Isadora's smile faltered. The king stopped before her. For the first time that night, she saw his eyes clearly. They were not cold, as people said. They were tired, watchful, filled with a loneliness that did not belong in a room so crowded. He asked if she understood what she was asking. Isadora blinked up at him, her courage wobbling beneath the sudden weight of his attention. Then, because fear had never helped her, and shame had already done its worst, she answered with the only shield she had left. Not fully, she said, but she imagined the food was better. A few people laughed again, though softer this time. Prince Lucian gave a startled grin, but the king did not laugh. He only looked at her, as though beneath the wine, the stained gown, and the foolish words, he had found something the court had spent years hiding from him. Then King Alaric reached out. He took Isadora's hand, and every laugh in the palace died. For a moment, the entire court seemed to forget how to breathe. Isadora's hand rested in the king's, warm from wine, trembling from disbelief. She stared at him, as though he had stepped out of a dream and into a mistake too large for either of them to survive. Around them, the laughter that had filled the palace moments earlier disappeared so completely that even the candles seemed to burn quieter. King Alaric did not release her. His gaze moved over the court, past the nobles who had mocked her, past the councilmen who had already chosen a queen for him, past Lady Lyra Sterling, whose smile was beginning to crack at the edges. Then his voice rang through the hall, calm and clear. "Then let the kingdom hear me. I accept." The words fell like a sword. No one moved. Lady Lyra's face changed first. The beauty remained, but the warmth vanished from it, leaving something pale and dangerous beneath. Lord Gideon Thorne stiffened near the council table, his fingers curling around the silver head of his cane. Mrs. Rosamond Vance looked as if the floor had opened beneath her, and she was deciding whether to faint from horror or calculation. Isadora, however, laughed. It was a small, uncertain sound, because surely this was still part of the joke. Surely the king, tired of stiff speeches and courtly pressure, had decided to entertain himself by answering madness with madness. A monarch could afford such humor. A ruined woman could not. She looked up at him with a dazed smile and murmured that he had excellent dramatic timing. But King Alaric did not smile. He turned his head slightly and ordered the royal seal to be brought. That was when the court truly understood. The laughter had ended, but now fear began moving through the hall in whispers. Nobles leaned toward one another. Ladies clutched their pearls. Councilmen exchanged glances sharpened by panic. What had been a drunken jest only moments before was suddenly standing at the edge of law. Lord Gideon stepped forward at once. His voice remained respectful, but there was iron beneath it. He warned that the dignity of the crown could not be placed in the hands of a wine-stained girl who had spoken without sense or standing. He spoke of tradition, of bloodlines, of the danger of allowing the monarchy to be turned into a spectacle before common eyes. Lady Lyra followed with softer cruelty. She did not shout, she did not need to. Her words were wrapped in concern as she declared that Isadora was clearly not in command of herself, that no honorable king would bind a confused woman to a vow made under drink, and that the court must protect both the crown and the poor creature embarrassing herself before it. Poor creature. The words reached Isadora through the haze of wine, and even then, they burned. Her hand twitched in the king's grasp, but Alaric held her still. Not tightly, not like a man trapping her, more like a man reminding the room that whatever they thought she was not alone at that moment. Then another voice cut through the rising protest. Duke Valerius Vance stepped forward. Until then, he had watched in silence, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke, the council listened. Men like Valerius did not waste words, and when they entered a matter, they usually did so with a blade already hidden beneath the sentence. He reminded the court of the ancient festival of Crowns Law, a law older than most of the noble houses now pretending to defend tradition. During the festival, if a marriage vow was offered publicly to the reigning monarch and accepted before the people, it could be sealed before dawn by crown authority, provided members of the council stood witness. The words struck the hall like thunder dressed in legal language. Lord Gideon's face tightened. Lady Lyra's eyes flashed. For the first time that night, Mrs. Rosamond looked at Isadora not with shame, but with a sudden greedy terror, as if the burden she had despised might become something too powerful to control. Isadora wanted to speak. She wanted to pull her hand away and demand that everyone stop looking at her as though she had become a battlefield. But the room kept turning, the lights kept blurring, and the king's hand remained the only steady thing in the whole palace. The royal seal arrived on a velvet cushion. The council protested until their protest became whispers. Lord Gideon argued until the law itself left him no more ground to stand on. Lady Lyra watched with a smile so still it looked carved into her face. And Duke Valerius remained nearby, silent again, but not passive. His presence alone seemed to warn the room that the Vance name, however disgraced, was not entirely without teeth. By the time the moon began to sink behind the palace towers, parchment had been unrolled. Witnesses had been called. The king had signed. Isadora remembered only fragments after that. The scratch of a quill, the scent of melted wax. The king's hand holding hers while the court watched in frozen disbelief. Duke Valerius standing in shadow, his eyes fixed on her as though he were measuring the cost of what had just happened. Lady Lyra Sterling, staring at her with such hatred that Isadora, even half drunk and dizzy, felt it like a blade against her skin. And somewhere beneath it all, the terrible feeling that a door had closed behind her. Not the door of a palace, the door of her old life. Before dawn, the bells were ordered. Before dawn, the law was sealed. Before dawn, the joke had become a marriage. And by sunrise, the woman they mocked had become the one woman they all had to bow to. Mourning did not make the palace kinder. It only made everything real. Isadora stood before a mirror taller than the doorway of her aunt's sitting room, barely recognizing the woman staring back at her. The maids had dressed her in robes of deep ivory and gold, fastening jewels at her throat, and arranging her hair beneath a delicate circlet that felt heavier than iron. The fabric was beautiful, almost painfully so, but it did not belong to her. None of it did. Not the room, not the crown, not the title people now whispered whenever they passed her door. Queen. The word followed her through the corridors like a sentence. When the palace doors opened before the royal council chamber, Isadora felt the full weight of what the night had done. The room was filled with nobles, ministers, commanders, and court officials, all arranged beneath painted ceilings and tall windows that poured morning light across their unforgiving faces. No one looked happy. Some looked insulted. Some looked disgusted. Some looked at her as though a servant had wandered onto the throne and refused to leave. The same mouths that had laughed at her the night before were now tight with outrage, because mockery was easy when a woman stood beneath them. It became unbearable when they were ordered to bow. King Alaric sat at the head of the chamber, wearing black and gold, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Prince Lucian watched the room with careful amusement, though even his smile carried caution now. Duke Valerius Vance stood near one of the tall windows, silent as a carved shadow, his eyes moving from face to face, as if memorizing every enemy before they spoke. Then Lady Lyra Sterling entered. The room seemed to make space for her. She wore pale silver, the color of moonlight and morning, and every step she took was graceful enough to wound. She looked like a bride abandoned at the altar, though no altar had ever been hers. Her face was calm, her posture perfect, but her eyes told the truth, her lips refused to confess. She hated Isadora, not with anger alone, with humiliation, with disbelief, with the fury of a woman who had spent her whole life walking toward a crown, only to watch it land on the head of someone she had laughed at. Lord Gideon Thorne rose first, his voice smooth and cold. He did not shout. Men like him did not need to. He spoke of law, dignity, stability, and the sacred image of the throne. He called the marriage unfortunate, reckless, a stain upon royal order. He demanded annulment before the kingdom could awaken fully to scandal. Several nobles murmured in agreement. Isadora stood in the center of the chamber, with her hands folded so tightly that her fingers ached. Shame burned through her, but anger burned hotter. They spoke as if she were not there, as if she were a mistake to be corrected, a stain to be washed out, a drunken embarrassment whose feelings were too small to matter. And perhaps, in their world, they were. But she was tired of being small. Before she could speak, King Alaric lifted one hand, and the room fell silent. The marriage, he said, was legal. The crown had accepted the vow. The seal had been placed before dawn, until the law itself found cause to break it. Isadora Vance was queen. The words sent a ripple through the chamber, but they did not comfort her. They only made the walls feel closer, because every eye that turned toward her now carried not laughter, but accusation. After the council was dismissed, Isadora did not wait for permission. She followed King Alaric into a private chamber and shut the door behind them with more force than any queenly lesson would have allowed. For the first time since waking, she looked at him not as a king, but as the man who had taken one foolish sentence and turned it into a cage. She asked him why. Why had he done it? Why had he turned her shame into a royal scandal? Why had he allowed the whole kingdom to believe she had wanted this? Why had he placed her before people who would rather see her dead than seated beside him? Alaric did not answer quickly. That frightened her more than any lie would have. At last he told her part of the truth. The council had been pressing him to marry Lady Lyra Sterling, not asking, pressing. Every noble house, every alliance, every hidden hand in the court had moved him toward her, and behind that pressure, he had begun to smell treason. Letters vanished. Guards were reassigned without his order. Loyal ministers were suddenly accused of disloyalty. Men who once feared the throne had begun acting as though they already owned it. Lady Lyra's family, he said, was connected to something dangerous, and Lord Gideon Thorne was too close to it. Isadora listened, still breathing hard, still furious. Then the meaning settled. He had not saved her from humiliation. He had used her to escape a trap. Her voice became quieter when she told him she was not a tool. The words struck deeper than she expected. King Alaric looked at her then, not with royal command, but with something almost like regret. He admitted that the marriage had begun as strategy, but he insisted he had not chosen her blindly. He had watched the court mock her. He had watched her stand through it. He had watched her speak one honest sentence in a room full of careful lies. He needed a queen no one in the palace controlled. Isadora almost laughed at the cruelty of it. All her life, people had called her useless. Now a king had found a use for her, and somehow that hurt just as much. Alaric offered her a bargain. 30 days. She would remain queen for 30 days while he uncovered the conspiracy moving through his court. She would have protection, royal authority, and every comfort owed to her rank. When the 30 days ended, if she wished to leave, he would grant her freedom, wealth, and safety, far from Mrs. Rosamond Vance and every noble who had ever shamed her. Freedom. The word reached the part of Isadora that still remembered cold rooms, unpaid debts, and her aunt's voice telling her she was nothing. She had no true home to return to, no fortune, no protector, no place in the world that would receive her kindly after this scandal. So she accepted, not because she trusted him, because the palace, dangerous as it was, had become the only door still open. Later that morning, as she walked through a quiet corridor lined with portraits of dead queens, Duke Valerius Vance stepped from the shadows and fell into step beside her. He did not flatter her. He did not bow too deeply. He simply warned her that the palace was not a place for careless honesty. Every word spoken there grew teeth. Every kindness could be twisted. Every mistake could be sharpened into a weapon. Isadora looked up at the painted faces of the queens before her, women dressed in gold and remembered in silence. Then she looked at Duke Valerius. Perhaps, she said, the palace had suffered too long without honesty. For the first time, something like approval touched his face. But somewhere beyond the marble walls, whispers were already gathering. Lady Lyra's humiliation had turned poisonous. Lord Gideon's plans had been disturbed, and the nobles who had laughed at Isadora now feared what her crown might expose. She had agreed to wear the crown for 30 days, not knowing some people in the palace had already decided she would not survive 3. For the next several days, Isadora learned that becoming queen was not as simple as placing gold upon a woman's head. The crown was not merely beautiful, it was heavy. It waited for her every morning on a velvet cushion, gleaming in the pale light as though it knew she feared it. Around her, maids moved quietly, dressing her in gowns that took 3 women to fasten, and jewels that made her neck ache before breakfast. Every sleeve had a rule. Every bow had a meaning. Every step through the palace seemed to require a lesson she had never been taught. She had survived Mrs. Rosamond's cruelty for years, but palace etiquette was a different kind of punishment. At court, she learned there were 7 ways to greet a duke, 5 ways to answer a royal minister, and 100 ways to insult a woman without ever raising one's voice. She learned that touching the wrong fork could become gossip by noon. She learned that turning away too quickly from an older noblewoman could be called disrespect. She learned that smiling too much made her foolish, while smiling too little made her proud. And whenever she made a mistake, the nobles noticed. They did not laugh loudly. That would have been too honest. They laughed softly behind gloved hands, behind fans, behind lowered lashes. Their amusement followed her through the palace, like perfume she could not wash away. Isadora pretended not to hear it, but she heard everything. Prince Lucian was the first person who made the palace feel less like a cage. He found her one afternoon standing in the wrong corridor, holding a folded invitation upside down and looking as though she was considering declaring war on the entire royal household. Instead of mocking her, he bowed deeply and announced that Her Majesty had successfully discovered the most useless hallway in the palace. Isadora stared at him. Then, despite herself, she laughed. From that day, Lucian became her unofficial guide through the strange theater of court life. He explained which lords were harmless fools, which ladies smiled only when planning murder, and which old ministers could be trusted with secrets only after they had eaten. He taught her how to nod when she did not understand, how to escape conversations without insulting anyone important, and how to recognize when a compliment was actually a warning. But even Lucian's humor could not soften every lesson. Queen Mother Evelina summoned Isadora on the fourth morning. The old queen received her in a sunlit chamber lined with portraits of dead monarchs, each one painted with the same cold dignity Isadora suspected she lacked. Evelina was dressed in dark violet, her silver hair pinned beneath a veil, her eyes sharp enough to make lies feel useless. She did not ask Isadora if she loved the king. She asked what a queen owed her people. Isadora could have given the answer expected of her. She could have spoken of obedience, grace, tradition, and noble duty. Those were the kinds of words queens were supposed to have ready. But Isadora had never been good at pretending. So she answered honestly. She said a queen owed the people her attention before her pride. She owed them justice, even when justice embarrassed the palace. She owed them truth, because poor people suffered most when rulers lied beautifully. The Queen Mother did not smile. For a long moment, she only looked at her. Then she asked what a queen must sacrifice. Isadora lowered her eyes and thought of her mother's old gown, her father's empty chair, her own name turned into a joke by people who had never gone hungry. Then she said, "Sometimes I think a woman sacrifices being understood." Something shifted in Evelina's face then. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. As though, for the first time, she had stopped seeing a drunken scandal and begun seeing a woman. After that, Duke Valerius took over the harsher part of her education. He did not teach gently. He taught like a man preparing someone for war. He showed Isadora the court seating charts and explained that no chair was innocent. He pointed out alliances hidden in marriage contracts, debts hidden beneath gifts, threats hidden inside invitations. He taught her that in the palace, a smile could be a greeting, an apology, a trap, or a blade. He warned her never to speak before watching who benefited from her words. Isadora listened, though not always quietly. Valerius told her that honesty was dangerous. She told him lies seemed to be doing worse damage. He looked at her for a long moment after that, and although he did not praise her, he did not correct her either. Late one evening, when the palace had grown quiet and the halls were washed in candlelight, King Alaric found her in the royal library. She was seated at a long table beneath towering shelves, surrounded by open books, old maps, and scrolls of kingdom law. Her crown sat beside her, instead of on her head. Her hair had loosened from its pins. Ink stained one of her fingers. She looked less like a queen and more like a woman stubbornly fighting a battle with words she had only just learned how to read. Alaric stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. He asked why she was trying so hard when she planned to leave after 30 days. Isadora did not look up immediately. She turned a page, traced a line of law with her finger, and then answered with quiet firmness. "Because even if I am only queen for a month, I refuse to be useless." The words stayed in the air between them. Alaric had been praised by diplomats, flattered by nobles, obeyed by soldiers, and feared by enemies. But no one in that palace had said anything like that to him in years. No one had spoken of duty without reaching for power. No one had treated the crown as something to serve rather than something to possess. He came closer and looked at the books spread before her. She had been studying village taxation, widow protections, and old laws about common petitions. Not jewels, not titles, not court privileges, people. For the first time, admiration entered his silence, and Isadora noticed something too. The king was always surrounded, guards at his doors, ministers at his table, nobles at his feet, servants waiting for his smallest command. Yet there was a loneliness around him that no crowd could hide. Everyone obeyed him, but almost no one looked at him. Everyone bowed, but almost no one stayed. She studied his face in the candlelight and saw the exhaustion beneath the crown. Then she said softly, "You are the most powerful man in the kingdom, yet you look like the loneliest." Alaric's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. For once, the king who always had an answer found none. He looked away toward the dark windows, where his reflection stood beside hers in the glass. A king who had chosen a wife to escape a trap. A woman who had accepted a crown because she had nowhere else to go. Neither of them belonged to the story the court was telling. And perhaps that was why, in the silence of that library, they understood each other more than either was ready to admit. The king had chosen Isadora to escape a trap, but he never expected her to become the first person who could see his heart. Lady Lyra Sterling did not strike immediately. That was not her way. She waited. She smiled when the court looked at her. She lowered her eyes when the king passed. She spoke of loyalty, dignity, and the kingdom's peace, with a voice so gentle that anyone who did not know better would have mistaken her patience for grace. But beneath the silk, beneath the pearls, beneath the perfect silver calm of her face, humiliation had become poison. She had been raised to believe the crown would one day rest upon her head. Every lesson, every gown, every alliance, every carefully measured smile had prepared her for that single destiny. Then Isadora Vance had stumbled into the center of the court with wine on her breath and shame on her gown, and somehow, impossibly, taken it all. Lyra could forgive many things, but she could not forgive being laughed at by fate. So when the royal banquet was announced in honor of the new queen, Lady Lyra came dressed not as a defeated woman, but as one preparing a stage. The banquet hall glowed with candlelight. Long tables were dressed in white linen and gold plates. Musicians played from the gallery. Servants moved silently between nobles who smiled with their lips and judged with their eyes. Isadora sat beside King Alaric, dressed in deep emerald silk, her crown resting carefully in her dark hair. She looked more composed than she felt. By then, she had learned enough to sit straight, to answer politely, to keep her hands still when nobles tried to unsettle her. But the palace still felt like a room full of traps, disguised as traditions. Lady Lyra approached with a smile bright enough to fool the careless. She welcomed Isadora before the court, praising the king's generosity and the surprising turns of destiny. Her words were polite, her meaning was not. Every sentence reminded the room that Isadora had not been expected, not trained, not chosen by blood or counsel. Then Lyra turned the knife more gently. She asked Isadora to lead the ancient queen's toast. A murmur passed through the hall. The toast was old, ceremonial, known only to women raised near the throne. It was not written on any card. It was not taught to outsiders. Every noble woman in the room knew this, and every one of them understood what Lyra had done. Isadora was meant to fail. For a moment, the hall seemed to lean toward her. Mrs. Rosamond, seated far below among lesser nobles, looked terrified and eager at once. Lord Gideon Thorne watched with cold interest. Duke Valerius Vance did not move, but his eyes sharpened. King Alaric glanced at Isadora, ready to intervene. But Isadora rose before he could. She lifted her cup. She did not know the ancient words. She knew that. Everyone knew that. So instead of pretending, she let the silence settle, then spoke from the only place in her no court lesson had touched. She spoke of a kingdom where the crown was not protected by marble walls alone. A kingdom where the farmer who broke his hands in the field mattered as much as the lord who taxed him. A kingdom where widows were not forgotten, servants were not invisible, and poor girls were not mocked for wearing repaired gowns to rooms built from their labor. Her voice did not tremble. She ended by saying that if she must be queen, even for a little while, then she would drink not to her own glory, but to the people who had never been invited to speak at tables like this. The hall remained silent, not because she had failed, because she had not. Among the servants standing along the walls, eyes lowered quickly, but not before tears shone in some of them. A few younger nobles looked moved despite themselves. Others looked offended, as though compassion were an insult to their bloodline. King Alaric watched her with something quiet and bright in his face. Lady Lyra's smile did not change, but her eyes hardened. Then the real attack began. A servant approached with the king's wine, the cup glowing red beneath the candles. Alaric reached for it absently, still looking at Isadora as though he were seeing her anew. But Isadora smelled it before the cup touched his lips. A bitter scent, sharp, wrong, buried beneath the sweetness of wine, but familiar enough to drag her back to childhood. Her mother's hands crushing herbs by the window. Her mother's warning that some plants healed in small measures and killed in secret. Isadora moved before thought could catch her. Her hand struck the cup from the king's grasp. Wine splashed across the table like blood. For one heartbeat, nobody understood. Then the hall erupted. Guards rushed forward. Nobles cried out. Servants froze. King Alaric stood, his face suddenly carved from stone. Lord Gideon Thorne was the first to speak clearly. His accusation came dressed as concern, but it landed exactly where he intended. He suggested the queen had caused a scene for attention, desperate to turn the court's pity into admiration after her embarrassing toast. Lady Lyra's voice followed, softer and more deadly. She wondered aloud whether the queen had known too much, too quickly, whether the danger had been discovered or arranged, whether saving the king in front of witnesses was not the perfect way for a desperate woman to make herself beloved. The room shifted. Suspicion moved faster than truth. Isadora looked to Alaric, expecting him to silence them. For a moment, his eyes met hers, and she saw that he did not believe them. But belief was not the same as power, not in a hall full of witnesses and enemies waiting for one wrong move. Then guards were sent to search her chambers. They returned with a small packet of dried poisonous herbs hidden inside her chest. The hall changed completely. The nobles who had been offended by her toast now looked satisfied. Mrs. Rosamond covered her mouth in horror that did not reach her eyes. Lady Lyra lowered her lashes, hiding triumph beneath sorrow. Lord Gideon called for immediate confinement until the council could determine the queen's guilt. Isadora could barely breathe. The herbs were not hers. The crime was not hers. The lie was so obvious that she thought surely the king would step down from his place and stand beside her. But King Alaric remained still. His face was pale with controlled rage, but his voice, when it came, was the voice of a monarch, not a husband. He ordered that Queen Isadora be escorted to guarded chambers while the matter was investigated. He did not call her guilty, but he let them take her. That was the part that broke through her anger and found something softer to wound. As the guards surrounded her, Isadora looked once at the king. She saw apology in his eyes. She saw calculation. She saw fear for her hidden beneath command. But what she needed was trust spoken loudly enough for the court to hear. And he gave her silence. The crown had made her queen, but one planted lie was about to make her a prisoner. The tower chamber was beautiful in the way prisons built for royalty were always beautiful. There were velvet chairs, tall windows, embroidered curtains, and a bed carved from dark polished wood. A fire burned low in the hearth. A silver tray of untouched food sat on a table near the wall. From a distance, it might have looked like comfort, but the door was locked. 2 guards stood outside it, and the windows opened only to a fall no one could survive. Isadora stood in the middle of the chamber, still wearing the emerald banquet gown, the same gown she had worn when she saved the king's life and lost everyone's trust in the same breath. The stain of spilled wine had dried along the sleeve. Her crown had been taken from her, not officially, not with ceremony, but quietly, as though someone feared she might remember she was queen if the gold remained on her head. For hours, no one came. That was when the silence began to do its cruel work. She replayed the banquet again and again, the bitter scent in the wine, the cup flying from Alaric's hand, Lady Lyra's soft voice turning suspicion into a weapon, Lord Gideon's calm accusation, the packet of herbs carried into the hall like proof from heaven, and then Alaric's eyes. That hurt more than all of it. He had not believed she was guilty. Isadora knew that. She had seen it clearly. But he had let them take her anyway, because kings did not move like ordinary men. Kings calculated. Kings waited. Kings protected the crown first and explained the wound later. She had spent her life being blamed by people who had power over her. She should have known a palace would be no different. Near evening, the lock turned. Isadora turned quickly, expecting perhaps a guard, perhaps a minister, perhaps some cold command from the council. Instead, Mrs. Rosamond Vance stepped into the room. Her aunt wore a dark gown and an expression carefully arranged into concern. But concern had never looked natural on her face. It sat there like borrowed jewelry. She did not run to Isadora. She did not ask if she was frightened. She looked around the chamber first, taking in the furniture, the silver tray, the thick carpets, the signs of royal importance surrounding the niece she had once treated like a burden. Only then did she speak. She said the situation was unfortunate. Terrible, really. A scandal that could destroy what little remained of their family name. But perhaps, with the right effort, with the right words spoken to the right people, she could still help. Isadora stared at her. Mrs. Rosamond moved closer and lowered her voice. She would speak in Isadora's defense, she said. She would remind the court of Isadora's gentle nature, her tragic upbringing, her innocence. But a woman of her age could not survive on gratitude alone. If Isadora was cleared, she would need to grant her aunt a proper estate, a generous income, and a title worthy of the woman who had raised the queen. For a moment, Isadora could not even answer. Then she laughed softly. There was no humor in it. She refused. Mrs. Rosamond's face hardened so quickly that Isadora wondered how she had ever mistaken the mask for anything else. Her aunt called her ungrateful, foolish, still proud with nothing to be proud of. Then, with a cruelty sharpened by years of practice, she said Isadora should not act surprised that the king had abandoned her. A woman like Isadora had never been meant to be loved by anyone, not by family, not by court, not by king. The words landed exactly where they were aimed. Isadora said nothing. She would not cry while her aunt stood there. That, at least, she could still deny her. When Mrs. Rosamond left, the chamber felt colder than before. But beneath the palace, far from the eyes of the court, the truth had begun to move. King Alaric did not sleep. Duke Valerius Vance, Prince Lucian, and Captain Dorian Vale joined him in a private strategy room where maps, servant lists, and guard reports lay scattered across a long table. The king's anger was quiet, which made it more dangerous. He had allowed Isadora to be confined because the accusation had been made before witnesses, but every instinct in him rejected the lie. Captain Dorian traced the movement of the guards. Prince Lucian questioned servants who had been near the queen's chambers. Duke Valerius examined the packet of herbs and noticed the seal on the wrapping. It did not come from any market. It came from the royal physician's locked cabinet. The discovery changed everything. Only a few people could have ordered access to that cabinet: the physician, the king, the queen mother, or a senior member of the council. Duke Valerius did not say Lord Gideon's name immediately. He did not have to. The suspicion sat in the room like a drawn blade. That night, long after the palace had quieted, King Alaric came to the tower himself. Isadora did not rise when he entered. She sat beside the window, wrapped in a plain shawl, her face turned toward the dark city below. The bells that had celebrated her that morning were silent now. The same kingdom that had called her queen was waiting to see whether she would be condemned as a traitor. Alaric dismissed the guards and spoke her name softly. She did not look at him. When she finally answered, her voice was calm in the way broken things sometimes became calm after the breaking was done. She told him she understood now. Poor women were always useful until powerful people needed someone to blame. Then their honesty became madness, their courage became ambition, and their innocence became a story no one cared to believe. The king absorbed the words without defending himself. Then he apologized, not as a monarch, not with polished language, as a man who knew he had wounded someone who had already been wounded too often. He told her he had not abandoned her. He had needed the court to believe she stood alone, so the real traitors would move boldly. But even as he said it, he knew the explanation did not erase the pain. Then, in the dim firelight, Alaric told her what few people in the kingdom knew. His father had not died from illness, as the court claimed. He had been betrayed by someone inside the palace. Someone trusted, someone who smiled at dinner and opened the door to death before dawn. Since that day, Alaric had learned to measure every word, doubt every loyalty, and treat trust as the first step toward a grave. Isadora turned to him then. For a long moment, she saw not the king who had taken her hand before the court, but the boy who had lost his father inside a palace full of liars. Her anger did not vanish, but it softened at the edges. She told him trust was not weakness when given to the right person. The words moved through him slowly, like light entering a room that had been locked for years. Neither of them spoke for a while. The fire crackled low. Outside, wind pressed against the tower windows. Alaric stepped closer, and this time, Isadora did not pull away. There was no vow, no confession, no kiss meant to solve what had been broken. Only his hand near hers on the window ledge, and the quiet understanding that something fragile had begun between them, despite the lies surrounding it. Then footsteps sounded beyond the door. A guard entered, pale and breathless. New evidence had been found, a letter, written in Isadora's name. In it, she supposedly confessed to planning the king's death, seizing the throne, and using the marriage as her path to power. Alaric took the letter, and his face turned colder with every line. Isadora did not need to read it to understand. The first lie had made her look guilty. The second lie was designed to make sure she never left the tower alive. By morning, the palace had stopped whispering. It was ready to watch. The royal court was opened for public judgment, and every noble who had laughed at Isadora's drunken proposal now gathered to witness what they believed would be her final humiliation. They came dressed in silk and velvet, with jewels at their throats and curiosity in their eyes, as though a woman's ruin was another form of entertainment. The great hall looked almost exactly as it had on the night Isadora became queen. The same golden pillars, the same polished marble floor, the same throne raised above the room like a promise and a threat. But this time, there was no music, no dancing, no laughter softened by wine, only judgment. Lady Lyra Sterling stood near the council seats in pale blue silk, serene as a saint painted on glass. She wore no crown, no obvious triumph, but triumph lived in every quiet breath she took. To anyone watching, she looked sorrowful, dignified, wounded by the scandal that had touched the throne. Beside her stood Lord Gideon Thorne. His face carried the practiced grief of a man who had spent years making lies sound like duty. He told the court that the king had been deceived by a desperate woman, a woman who had hidden ambition behind humor, a woman who had used the pity of the crown to climb where she did not belong. The nobles listened eagerly. Some nodded before he finished. Because they had wanted this story from the beginning, they wanted Isadora to be guilty. It made the world feel orderly again. It meant the poor girl had not risen because she was brave, or honest, or worthy. She had risen because she was dangerous. Then the doors opened. Isadora entered without a crown. She wore simple white, plain enough to look almost like surrender. There was no gold in her hair, no jewels at her throat, no royal embroidery to remind them of the title they hated giving her. Yet somehow, without all those things, she looked more like herself than she ever had in queenly robes. The court waited for tears. They expected shaking hands, a lowered head, a desperate plea for mercy. But Isadora walked to the center of the hall and stood tall. She looked first at the king, seated on the throne with a face so controlled it revealed nothing. Then she looked at the nobles, at the council, at Lady Lyra, at Lord Gideon, and at the same marble floor where she had once made the whole court laugh. When she spoke, her voice did not break. She said she had entered the palace through a foolish joke. She admitted that. She had been wounded, humiliated, and drunk enough to say what a wiser woman would have swallowed. But she had learned something since becoming queen. She had learned that the true foolishness in the court was not a poor woman speaking out of turn. It was a kingdom that mistook bloodline for honor. The room went still. She said noble birth did not make a person loyal. Fine manners did not make a person kind. A perfect smile did not make a woman worthy of a crown. And if the court hated her because she had not been trained to lie beautifully, then perhaps that hatred said more about them than it did about her. Lady Lyra's fingers tightened around her fan. Lord Gideon's eyes narrowed. Then Duke Valerius Vance stepped forward. He carried the forged letter in one hand and a sealed ink vial in the other. His voice was calm, but it cut through the hall with the precision of a blade. He explained that the letter accusing Isadora had been written with rare royal ink, an ink used only for private council decrees, and restricted to senior members of the court. A murmur ran through the nobles. Lord Gideon's expression did not change, but a thin line appeared at the corner of his mouth. Prince Lucian moved next. The laughter was gone from him now. He looked younger than the men around him, but no less dangerous. He called forward a trembling servant girl who had been posted near the queen's chambers on the night before the herbs were discovered. The girl could barely lift her eyes, but her voice carried enough. She had seen Lady Lyra near Isadora's rooms, not passing by, entering. The hall stirred like a nest of disturbed snakes. Lady Lyra turned pale, then recovered quickly. She called the servant confused, frightened, easily bought. But before her denial could settle, Captain Dorian Vale entered with the royal physician. The physician looked broken. He knelt before the throne and confessed that the poisonous herbs had come from his locked cabinet. Lord Gideon had ordered him to surrender them under threat of accusing his son of treason. He had obeyed out of fear, then watched an innocent queen blamed for a crime she had stopped with her own hand. Now the court truly began to shift. Whispers became alarm. Faces turned toward Lord Gideon. And then King Alaric rose. The hall fell silent at once. His voice was cold when he revealed the truth. The trial had never been arranged to condemn Isadora. It had been arranged to expose those who thought she stood alone. He had allowed Lord Gideon and Lady Lyra to believe their second lie had succeeded, because men and women who believed themselves victorious often grew careless with their sins. Lord Gideon looked at the exits. Duke Valerius noticed. Captain Dorian noticed too. Lady Lyra, however, lost the mask first. All her grace cracked open at once. She turned on Isadora with hatred too raw to hide and accused her of stealing what was never meant for her. The crown, the king, the future. Everything Lyra had been promised since childhood. For the first time, Isadora did not shrink beneath her cruelty. She faced her calmly and answered, "I did not steal your crown, Lady Lyra. I only wore what your cruelty made you unworthy to receive." The words struck the court harder than any shout. No one laughed, no one whispered. For the first time since the wedding, the court was not laughing at Isadora. They were fearing her. Lord Gideon Thorne understood the court had turned before anyone else did. He saw it in the eyes of the nobles who had leaned toward him only moments before. He saw it in the guards shifting their hands toward their swords. He saw it in the stillness of King Alaric's face, and in the way Duke Valerius Vance had quietly moved between him and the nearest door. The mask of sorrow fell from Gideon's face. For one sharp second, the man beneath appeared. Cold, cornered, dangerous. Then he lifted his hand. From the upper gallery, 3 men dressed as palace servants drew hidden blades and moved toward the throne. The court erupted. Noble women screamed. Chairs overturned. Ministers stumbled backward in panic. For a breath, the great hall became chaos, exactly the kind Gideon had counted on. If the king could be seized, if Isadora could be blamed, if blood could be spilled before truth settled, perhaps the lie could still be saved. But King Alaric had not survived years inside a nest of traitors by being careless. Duke Valerius was already moving. He crossed the floor with the calm speed of a man who had expected betrayal and merely waited for it to show its face. Captain Dorian Vale's guards emerged from the side arches, surrounding the hidden attackers before they could reach the throne. Steel flashed beneath the chandeliers. One traitor fell to his knees. Another was disarmed against a marble pillar. The third tried to run and found Prince Lucian waiting with a drawn sword and a smile that held no humor at all. Lord Gideon turned toward the council exit. Duke Valerius blocked his path. There was no dramatic speech between them, no final debate, only Gideon's fury meeting Valerius's silence, and then Captain Dorian's guards closed around the corrupted visor and bound his wrists before the entire court. The man who had spoken of loyalty was dragged away as a traitor. Yet even with Gideon defeated, Lady Lyra Sterling refused to surrender gracefully. Her world had collapsed in front of everyone. The crown she believed was hers had slipped beyond her reach. The king she had expected to command had exposed her. The court that once praised her now watched with suspicion. And Isadora Vance, the ruined woman in the repaired gown, still stood unbroken at the center of it all. So Lyra reached for the only weapon she had left: cruelty. She turned to Isadora, her face pale with rage, and told her not to mistake survival for love. The king had never wanted her. He had never chosen her. She was only a convenient mistake, a drunken woman, useful enough to block an unwanted marriage, and foolish enough to believe a crown could become affection. The hall went silent, not because the words were new, because they struck the fear Isadora had tried hardest to bury. Isadora did not look at Lyra. She looked at King Alaric. This was the moment where a softer woman might have begged for comfort, and a weaker man might have hidden behind romance. But Isadora did not need protection dressed as pretty words. She needed truth. Even if it hurt her, even if it humiliated him, even if the whole court heard it. King Alaric stepped down from the throne. For the first time since the trial began, he did not speak like a ruler addressing subjects. He spoke like a man standing before the woman whose trust he had nearly lost. He admitted it. He told the court that when he accepted Isadora's drunken proposal, he had done it because he needed to escape a dangerous alliance. He had needed to break the council's grip, to stop Lady Lyra's family from entering the throne, and to draw the hidden traitors into the light. He had seen Isadora's courage, yes, but the first decision had been strategy. A murmur moved through the hall. Isadora stood very still. Then Alaric continued. He said strategy explained the beginning, but it did not explain what came after. It did not explain the woman who studied laws at midnight because she refused to be useless. It did not explain the queen who spoke for servants when nobles expected a ceremonial toast. It did not explain the hand that knocked poisoned wine from his grasp before fear could freeze her. It did not explain the voice in the tower that told him trust was not weakness when given to the right person. His voice softened, but it carried to every corner of the hall. Isadora had brought truth into a palace full of lies. She had challenged him when others obeyed. She had angered him when others flattered. She had protected him when others plotted. And somehow, without trying, she had made him feel less like a crown on a throne and more like a man with a heart still worth saving. Then King Alaric did something no one expected. He knelt, not to the court, not to tradition, to her. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. There was no wine now, no laughter, no ancient law waiting to trap them, no council pressure, no political game hidden behind the question. Only the king, kneeling before the woman they had once mocked. He asked Isadora Vance to remain his queen, not because of law, not because of scandal, not because of a mistake made beneath festival lights, but because he chose her with all that he was. Isadora's eyes filled, but she did not break. She had been insulted too many times to accept beautiful words without weight. So she asked him if he wanted a quiet queen, one who would smile when told, bow when ordered, and make the palace comfortable again. Alaric looked up at her. He said he wanted the woman who turned his crown from a burden into a promise. That was when the last wall inside Isadora gave way. Not all at once, not foolishly, but enough. She placed her hand in his, the way he had once taken hers before a laughing court. Only this time, she was not drunk. She was not ashamed. She was not being carried by accident into a destiny she did not understand. This time, she chose too. She accepted him. A sound moved through the great hall, quiet at first, then spreading like wind through wheat. One by one, the nobles lowered their heads. Some bowed from respect, some from fear, some because they finally understood that the woman they had laughed at was no longer standing beneath them. She had risen beyond them. Duke Valerius Vance watched from near the council steps, and for the first time, his stern face softened into the smallest smile. The forgotten branch of his family, the ruined girl they had dismissed, had not merely survived the court. She had conquered it without becoming cruel. The joke that began in shame had become the vow that healed a king. The kingdom remembered the scandal for years, not because Isadora Vance had asked the king to marry her while drunk beneath festival lights, but because of what she became after the laughter ended. She did not become the kind of queen the court expected. She did not hide her past behind gold or pretend she had been born flawless. She did not soften her voice to please nobles who had once sharpened theirs against her. Instead, she carried every insult, every stain, every cold night in Mrs. Rosamond's house into the throne room and used them to remember the people the palace had forgotten. Her first decree was simple. Once every month, the palace gates would open to common petitioners. Farmers came with tax complaints. Widows came with unpaid claims. Servants came with stories no noble had ever bothered to hear, and Isadora listened. Not from a balcony, not from behind a curtain. She sat beside King Alaric in the great hall and made the powerful answer the powerless in daylight. Then she turned to the healing houses. With memories of her mother's gentle hands and old herbal lessons, she ordered village clinics to be repaired, stocked, and protected from greedy officials. She made sure no sick child was turned away because a family lacked coin. She made sure no widow had to beg 3 noblemen for permission to survive. Some nobles hated her for it. The people loved her for it. Mrs. Rosamond Vance received none of the wealth she had tried to bargain for. No estate, no title, no seat near the throne. Isadora gave her only what justice allowed, and nothing more. Lady Lyra Sterling was banished from court, stripped of influence, and sent far from the palace she had once believed would belong to her. Lord Gideon Thorne was imprisoned for treason, his name becoming a warning whispered in council chambers for generations. Duke Valerius Vance remained close to the throne. In time, he became one of Isadora's fiercest protectors, not because she needed saving, but because he believed in what she was building. Together, they restored honor to the Vance name, not through wealth or fear, but through service. And Queen Mother Evelina, who had once doubted the girl in the stained gown, came to Isadora one quiet afternoon and placed an old royal brooch in her hand. She told her the kingdom had never needed a perfect queen. It had needed a truthful one. A year later, during the next Festival of Crowns, Isadora stood on the palace balcony beside King Alaric. Below them, the capital glowed with lanterns. Music drifted through the streets. Thousands of voices rose into the evening, not laughing now, not mocking, but cheering her name. Alaric leaned close, his voice low enough that only she could hear, and asked if she had any more drunken proposals to make. Isadora smiled, looking out over the kingdom that had once judged her, and now called her beloved. "Only one," she said. "Stay with me, even when I am impossible." The king took her hand. That was never a joke. And as the bells rang over the capital, Isadora understood at last that destiny did not always arrive dressed in dignity. Sometimes it stumbled into a palace with wine on its breath, pain in its heart, and one foolish sentence brave enough to change everything. She had drunkenly asked the king to marry her as a joke. By morning, she was his queen. But by the end, she became the woman brave enough to turn a lonely throne into a home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more emotional royal stories filled with love, betrayal, secrets, and powerful endings. Join our storytelling family and stay for the next tale, because in this kingdom, the woman everyone mocks today may become the queen everyone bows to tomorrow.